Pragmata is finally here, and today we're testing its performance on the GTX 1660 Super paired with the i5 9400F at 1080p. We'll be checking performance across multiple graphics settings, overall smoothness, VRAM usage, and whether this older mid-range setup can still deliver a good experience in 2026. Let's move on to our first graphics settings preset. The game is currently running at 1080p low settings using native resolution on the 1660 Super paired with the i5 9400F. Also keep in mind that I'm going to keep the textures at medium 1GB option across all settings to keep our VRAM in check, as this GPU only has 6GB of VRAM. At low settings, performance feels very smooth overall, with stable frame times during most gameplay sections. GPU usage remains consistently high, while the processor handles the game comfortably without major issues. Even during combat and heavier scenes, the experience remains responsive and very playable on this setup. Moving on to medium settings, the game is still running at 1080p, using native resolution on the 1660 Super. Performance here remains surprisingly solid overall, with frame rates mostly staying around the 60 FPS range. Depending on the area and scene complexity, gameplay fluctuates between the high 50s and high 60s during normal exploration and combat. There are a few moments where the processor starts showing a slight bottleneck, especially in heavier areas with more effects and environmental detail, but for the majority of gameplay, the experience still feels smooth and consistent on this setup. With FSR3 now enabled on quality mode while keeping the same medium settings, performance sees a noticeable improvement on the 1660 Super. Frame rates now move into the high 60s and even high 70s, depending on the area and scene complexity. The game still appears to be fairly processor demanding though, and there are moments where the processor slightly limits overall GPU utilization in heavier sections. Even with that limitation, gameplay continues to feel very smooth overall, and locking the game to 60 FPS would easily provide a very solid and consistent experience on this setup. Moving on to high settings at 1080p using native resolution, performance starts dropping quite noticeably on the 1660 Super. Compared to medium settings, gameplay definitely feels heavier overall, with frame rates frequently falling below 60 FPS and sometimes dropping into the 40s during more demanding combat scenes. In this first area specifically, performance mostly stays between the low 50s and mid 60s during exploration, while combat can push the frame rate down into the high 40s at times. At these settings, the game really starts benefiting from some form of upscaling if you want a smoother and more enjoyable experience on this GPU. Enabling FSR3 on quality mode with the same high settings provides a very noticeable boost in performance on the 1660 Super. Frame rates now jump from the mid-50s into the 70s during most gameplay sections, and in lighter areas the game can even push beyond 80 FPS at times. The overall experience immediately feels much smoother compared to native resolution, especially during exploration and normal combat scenarios. While the processor still slightly limits performance in some heavier sections, the combination of high settings and FSR quality mode delivers a far more enjoyable and balanced experience overall. However, once we move into this much larger area, the processor starts bottlenecking the 1660 Super far more heavily compared to the previous section of the game. Even with FSR3 enabled on quality mode at high settings, performance drops back into the 50s quite frequently throughout the more demanding parts of this area. The increased environmental scale, effects, and overall scene complexity seem to put a much heavier load on the processor here. That being said, performance still recovers nicely in smaller sections and tighter indoor areas, where the frame rate climbs back above 60 FPS and gameplay feels noticeably smoother again. With FSR frame generation now enabled alongside FSR 3 quality mode in the same area, frame rates see another noticeable increase on the 1660 Super. Performance now moves up into the 70s and even the 80s during many parts of gameplay, making movement and camera motion appear much smoother overall. However, the processor bottleneck still remains present in this larger area, preventing the GPU from reaching its full potential consistently. Frame pacing also becomes a bit less stable here, with the Frametime graph showing more noticeable stuttering compared to using FSR quality mode alone. Even though the higher frame rate improves overall smoothness visually, the added CPU limitation and Frametime inconsistencies are still noticeable during heavier gameplay moments. Once we move into the smaller sections of this area, performance improves quite significantly compared to the larger open sections. Frame rates now jump well into the hundreds at times, occasionally reaching around 130 FPS, while most gameplay generally stays within the 90s and low hundreds range. Gameplay here feels much smoother overall, and frame pacing also appears noticeably more stable compared to the previous open area. Now with FSR quality mode disabled and only frame generation enabled while running at native 1080p resolution, performance drops slightly back into the 80s and 90s. Even then, the game still feels very smooth overall, and input latency on a controller is barely noticeable during normal gameplay. Visual clarity also improves quite a lot at native resolution, with the game looking noticeably sharper compared to using FSR quality mode. Personally, this feels like the better overall experience, even if the frame rate is lower than the previous triple-digit results with upscaling enabled. Now, I did try pushing the game all the way to max settings, but the moment shadow quality and mesh quality are both set to maximum, the 1660 Super completely runs out of available VRAM. Performance immediately tanks below 30 FPS, and Frametime Stability also takes a massive hit. The Frametime graph, let's just say it looks like it's trying to communicate in Morse code with all those spikes. At these settings, the game clearly becomes too demanding for the available VRAM buffer, and overall gameplay responsiveness drops quite heavily as a result. Overall, Pragmata delivers a surprisingly solid experience on the 1660 Super, especially with a few optimized settings and upscaling enabled where needed. While larger areas can become fairly processor demanding at times, the game still remains very playable overall, and with the right balance of settings, smooth gameplay is definitely achievable on this hardware. For me personally, high settings with native 1080p resolution and frame generation enabled provided the best overall balance between image quality and performance. If you enjoyed this benchmark, feel free to subscribe for more GPU tests, optimization guides, and performance comparisons. Thanks for watching.